The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after my husband's funeral. I was standing in the kitchen of our house in Oakville, still in my housecoat, holding a mug of tea I hadn't touched. The steam had long gone cold. Outside, the maple in the front yard was just beginning to bud the kind of pale, hesitant green that shows up every April in Ontario, as if the tree isn't quite sure yet whether it's safe to come back. Gerald had loved that tree. He planted it the year we moved in, 31 years ago, when our son Derek was still small enough to carry on his shoulders. I was thinking about Derek on Gerald's shoulders, laughing, reaching up toward branches that weren't there yet when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick it up, some quiet instinct I couldn't explain, the way you sometimes reach for a door handle before you've consciously decided to open the door. "Is this Maureen Calloway?" The voice was a man's. Steady. Professional. "It is," I said. "My name is Philip Renshaw. I was Gerald's colleague at Hartwell and Associates. We worked together for about 12 years. He paused. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Calloway." Gerald was one of the finest men I've ever known. I thanked him. "I said what you say. I was still looking at the maple tree." "I'm calling," he said carefully, "because I've come across something that I believe you need to see, something Gerald left at the office." Another pause, longer this time. "I want to be straightforward with you. What I found, it changes some things, and I think you should see it before anyone else does." I set the cold mug down on the counter. "Before anyone else?" I repeated. "Yes." His voice dropped slightly. "I would ask, if you're willing, that you come to my office. Just you. Please don't mention this call to Derek or to his wife. I know that sounds strange. I promise it will make sense when you get here." After I hung up, I stood very still for a long moment. The kitchen felt enormous and quiet. 3 days earlier, this room had been full of people, Derek's colleagues, neighbors I barely knew, women from my old book club pressing casserole dishes into my hands, and now it was just me and the cold tea and the budding maple and a phone call that had left me feeling like the floor had shifted an inch beneath my feet. I was 64 years old. I had been married to Gerald Calloway for 38 years. I had raised a son in this house, planted a vegetable garden in the backyard, driven the same route to the grocery store so many times I could do it without thinking. I was not a woman who expected surprises. I was not a woman who expected much of anything anymore, if I was being honest with myself. I went upstairs and got dressed. I should tell you about the weeks leading up to that morning, because they matter. They matter more than I understood at the time. Gerald had been sick for 8 months. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that moves fast and doesn't negotiate. He was diagnosed in August and gone by March, and in between those 2 months, we had tried to keep things as normal as possible, which is what you do when normal is the only thing you have left to hold on to. Derek had been attentive through the illness. He drove up from Toronto on weekends, sometimes with his wife Sandra, sometimes alone. He helped Gerald with his medications, sat with him in the evenings, did the yard work I no longer had time for. I was grateful. I told him so, often. But somewhere in those 8 months, something had shifted in the way my son looked at me. It was subtle at first, a hesitation before answering a question, a glance exchanged with Sandra that stopped when I walked into the room. Small things. The kind of things you notice and then tell yourself you're imagining because the alternative that the person you raised doesn't quite trust you anymore is too uncomfortable to sit with. After the funeral, it became less subtle. On the second evening, Derek sat me down at the kitchen table and told me he'd been thinking about the house. "It's a lot of space for one person, Mom," he said. He had his hands folded on the table the way he used to when he was preparing for a difficult conversation, which I recognized because I had watched him learn that gesture from his father. 4 bedrooms, the maintenance alone. "I'm aware of how many bedrooms there are," I said. "I've lived here for 31 years. "Right." He nodded slowly. "But going forward, with Dad gone, I just think it makes sense to start thinking about options." Options. I noticed he didn't list any. Sandra was quieter than Derek, but in some ways more direct. She had strong opinions about practicality, about efficiency, about things making sense. The next morning, she mentioned a retirement community in Burlington, not a nursing home. She was careful to say, more of an active living community that had a lovely 2-bedroom unit available. She had already looked into it. She had a brochure on her phone. I looked at her across the breakfast table. She was 38 years old. She had good intentions, I believe, but she was looking at me the way people look at a problem they've already solved in their heads and are now just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. "I'm 64, I said pleasantly. "I don't think I'm quite ready for a retirement community." She smiled. "Of course. It's just something to keep in mind." That evening, Derek mentioned that it might be a good idea if I didn't make any major financial decisions for a while, just until I'd had time to process. He offered to help manage things, the accounts, the mortgage, the investments Gerald had set up over the years, just to take the pressure off. I said I'd think about it. But that night, lying in the dark in the bedroom Gerald and I had shared for 3 decades, listening to the house settle around me, I thought about something Gerald had said to me the week before he died. We were sitting together in the afternoon light, the way we had taken to doing near the end, just sitting, not always talking. And out of a long silence he had said very quietly, "Maureen, if anything happens that doesn't feel right, trust what you know. You've always known more than you think you do." I hadn't known what he meant. I had squeezed his hand and told him not to worry. I thought it was the medication talking, or the strange philosophical drift that illness sometimes brings. Lying there in the dark, I began to wonder if he'd been trying to tell me something specific. Philip Renshaw's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Toronto, 20 minutes from Union Station. I took the GO train in, which felt strange. I hadn't ridden the GO train alone in years, and walked the 4 blocks in the April wind with my coat pulled tight. The receptionist brought me water and asked me to wait. I sat in a chair by the window and looked out at the city and thought about Gerald taking this same commute for 23 years. He had liked the train, he said. It gave him time to think. Philip Renshaw was in his late 50s, trim and gray-haired, with the quiet, careful manner of someone who had spent a career dealing with sensitive information. He shook my hand firmly and thanked me for coming. "I want to begin," he said, once we were seated, "by telling you that what I'm about to share with you was not easy for me to sit on, even for 3 days. I found this on Friday afternoon, the day of Gerald's service. I thought about calling sooner, but I didn't want to intrude." He opened a drawer and placed a sealed envelope on the desk between us. My name was written on the front in Gerald's handwriting. I looked at it for a moment without speaking. "There's more," Philip said, "but I think you should read that first." I picked up the envelope. My hands were steadier than I expected. I opened it carefully, the way I used to open letters when letters still mattered. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. Gerald's handwriting, again the neat, slightly slanted print he'd used his whole life, the same handwriting that had left notes on the fridge and signed birthday cards and filled out crossword puzzles on Sunday mornings for 38 years. "Maureen, if Philip has given you this, then I wasn't able to give it to you myself, which means things got worse faster than I hoped. I'm sorry I couldn't say this in person. I tried a few times and I could never find the right words, which you know has never been my strong suit. I need you to know something about the account at Meridian, the one in your name only, not the joint account. I set it up 4 years ago. Philip knows about it. There is enough there that you will not need to depend on anyone for anything. Not the house, not your daily life, not your future. It is yours completely. I want you to use it. The reason I didn't tell you before is that I wasn't sure you'd let me do it if you knew I was planning it. You've always been stubborn about fairness, but this isn't about fairness. This is about me knowing my son, and knowing that grief can make people do things they wouldn't otherwise do, and wanting you to be protected no matter what. I love you. I have loved you every single day. Please don't sell the house if you don't want to. Please don't move anywhere you don't want to move. Please remember that you know more than you think you do. Gerald." I read it twice, then I folded it back along the same creases and held it in my lap. Philip waited. "He set up an account," I said finally. "Yes. 4 years ago, when the real estate market was strong and he'd just received a significant bonus, he moved funds gradually over time, nothing that would raise flags, nothing irregular. It's completely above board." Philip leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Calloway, the balance is substantial. Enough that the house is irrelevant, in a sense. You could keep it indefinitely, or sell it on your own terms, whenever you choose. The decision is entirely yours. I looked out the window at the gray Toronto sky. He never told me, I said. It wasn't an accusation, it was just a fact I was turning over. He said he tried to once. About 2 years ago, he said you told him to stop being morbid. I laughed. A short, involuntary sound, because I remembered that conversation. We had been on the back deck in September, and Gerald had started to say something about what would happen if, and I had told him to stop it, that we weren't having that conversation, that everything was fine. Everything was fine then. We didn't know yet. He also said, Philip continued more gently, that he was worried about Derek. Not because Derek is a bad person, Gerald always said that, but because he'd watched his son grow into someone who solved problems by controlling them, and he was afraid that after he was gone, you might become a problem Derek thought needed solving. The word landed quietly in the room between us. Solving. I thought about the brochure Sandra had pulled up on her phone. I thought about Derek's offer to manage the accounts. I thought about how carefully they had both avoided asking me what I wanted. I picked up the envelope again and held it. There's something else, Philip said. He reached into the drawer again and produced a second document several pages, stapled. Gerald updated his will 8 months ago, shortly after the diagnosis. You are the sole executor and primary beneficiary. Derek receives a specific bequest, a generous one. Gerald was very clear about that, but the estate decisions, including the house and all joint assets, are yours alone. He slid the document across the desk. I looked at the first page. I saw my name. I saw Gerald's signature at the bottom. I saw the notary seal. Did Derek know he'd updated it? I asked. Philip was quiet for a moment. Gerald didn't discuss the specifics with Derek, no. He told Derek that he'd taken care of things. He said, and I'm quoting here, because he said this to me directly, Derek knows I've been responsible. He doesn't need the details until Maureen has had time to find her footing. Find her footing. 38 years, and he was still thinking about my footing, still quietly making sure the ground was solid beneath me before he left. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment. Not because I was falling apart, I had done most of my falling apart in the weeks before the funeral, the private kind, in the car, in the shower, in the garden, in the early morning when no one could see. I pressed my hand against my mouth because the love in it, the quiet, logistical, entirely unromantic love of a man who set up a secret bank account so his wife would never have to feel small, was almost more than I could hold all at once. Thank you, I said to Philip, for finding this, for calling. He asked me to, if it came to that. He said it simply, without drama. He called it his backup plan. He said, if I can't get there myself, Phil, make sure she hears it from someone she can trust. I drove home. I had taken a cab to the train, taken the train, and now I was in a cab again, watching the highway unspool toward Oakville, and I sat with everything I now knew and thought about what to do with it. I could simply say nothing. Keep the information close, the way Gerald had kept it. Let things settle. But I thought about the way Derek had folded his hands on the table. I thought about the brochure. I thought about options and going forward and taking the pressure off. I thought about how many small conversations add up to a large assumption, and how quickly a large assumption can harden into a plan. And I thought, Gerald spent 8 months sick and still found the energy to make sure I would be all right. The least I could do was be all right. Derek came for dinner that Thursday. Sandra had a work event in the city, so it was just the two of us, which I was glad for. I made roast chicken, his favorite since childhood, the recipe his grandmother had passed to me, the one with lemon and thyme. The kitchen smelled like every Sunday of his growing up. We ate and talked about ordinary things, his work, a friend of his who just had a baby, the weather warming up. I was good company, I think. I asked questions and listened. I poured wine. I was calm in a way I had not been in months, and I think Derek noticed it, because somewhere in the middle of dinner he looked at me differently, a little uncertain. After dinner, while I was making tea, he brought it up again. Mom, I was thinking more about what we discussed earlier this week, about the house, about getting things organized. I brought the tea to the table and sat down. I looked at my son, 40 years old, Gerald's eyes, my mother's jawline, a good man who had learned to manage things because managing things was how he showed love, and who had not yet learned the difference between helping someone and deciding for them. I've actually given it a lot of thought, I said, and I've spoken with Philip Renshaw. A slight pause. Philip, from your dad's office? Yes. He reached out with some information about your father's estate that I think you should know. I folded my hands on the table. Not the way Derek did it, not as preparation for a difficult conversation, but because I wanted something to hold on to. Your father was very thorough, Derek. He took care of things. I'm going to be fine. And I'm going to stay in this house for as long as I want to stay here. Derek opened his mouth and then closed it. I know you've been worried, I said. I know that's where all of this is coming from. The Burlington community, the offer to manage the finances, I know it's care. I know you. I looked at him steadily. But I need you to know that I'm 64 years old, and I'm not fragile, and I'm not lost. I'm grieving. That's different. Grieving is something I get to do on my own timeline, in my own house, in the way that makes sense to me. He was quiet for a moment. The old wall clock ticked. The maple tapped gently against the window in the April breeze. I just didn't want you to be alone with everything, he said finally. His voice was different, less organized. I know. I reached across the table and put my hand over his, the way I had when he was small and worried about something he couldn't name. And I'm grateful that you love me enough to try. But what I need from you right now isn't management. I need you to come for dinner on Thursdays. I need you to call me on Sunday mornings the way your father used to. I need you to trust that I know what's good for me. He looked at the table for a long moment, then he nodded. One short, slightly undone nod. Okay, he said. Okay, Mom. We finished our tea. He helped me with the dishes. Before he left, he hugged me at the door for a long time, the full-body hug he'd stopped doing somewhere in his 20s and had only brought back in the last 8 months, standing in hospital corridors and doorways, learning all over again how to hold on. He was really something, wasn't he? Derek said against my shoulder. Not a question. He really was, I said. I stood at the door and watched his car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. The neighborhood was quiet. Someone, a few houses down, had put out their patio furniture, hopeful against the April weather. The streetlights had come on, soft and amber. The maple was fully in bud now, a full, small explosion of green. I stood there for a while, just breathing. In the weeks that followed, I did things I hadn't done in a long time. I called my friend Ruth in Halifax, who I hadn't spoken to properly in almost 2 years, not since before Gerald's diagnosis, when life had narrowed down to hospitals and prescriptions and the slow, patient business of being present for someone who is leaving. We talked for 2 hours. She made me laugh 3 times. She was coming to visit in June. I went back to my book club. I had dropped out in October, told them I couldn't commit to the reading, but Janet, who ran the group and had known me for 15 years, had kept sending me the titles anyway, every month, just in case. I showed up on a Wednesday evening with a bottle of red wine, and nobody made a fuss about where I'd been, which is the best thing a group of women can do for you. I called the bank and made an appointment to sit with a financial advisor alone, without Derek, with my own list of questions written on a notepad I'd found in Gerald's desk. The advisor was a woman about my age named Carol, and she was thorough and clear and did not once speak to me as though I needed to be protected from information. I left that meeting knowing exactly where I stood. It was a good feeling, clean, like cold water. I also called Philip Renshaw one more time, to thank him properly and to ask him one question that had been sitting with me. Did Gerald ever worry that setting things up this way without telling me was taking a decision away from me? I asked. Philip was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes. He mentioned that. He said he'd wrestled with it. But he told me, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is the gist, he said, Maureen's always believed in fairness. She would have wanted the money distributed evenly, wanted everyone to have the same. But this isn't about what's fair. It's about what's safe. And sometimes you have to make the decision to protect someone before they realize they need protection. I thought about that for a long time after I hung up. I didn't entirely agree with it. I think Gerald should have told me. I think even a private, practical conversation about money and futures is still a conversation worth having, and that keeping it from me, however lovingly, had left me weeks of unnecessary confusion and a few very unsettling dinners with my son. I think if he had it to do again, knowing what those weeks were like, he might have chosen differently. But I also know who Gerald was. I know the particular, careful shape of how he loved. And I know that when he sat in that September sun and told me he wanted to talk about what would happen if, and I said, "Stop it, Gerald. Stop being morbid," he'd respected that. He'd backed down. He'd found another way. He'd found Philip. June came, and with it Ruth. She arrived on a Friday afternoon with a wheelie bag and a bottle of Newfoundland Screech she'd brought as a joke and a genuine bottle of Pinot Gris she'd brought because she knew me. We sat on the back deck until 9 o'clock in the evening, watching the last light leave the sky over the garden, talking about everything. I told her about the letter, about the account, about Derek and the brochure and the dinner and the way things had settled between us in the weeks since. Imperfectly but honestly, the way most things settle when you stop being careful and start being direct. Ruth listened without interrupting, which she is very good at for a woman who talks as much as she does. "He really left you a letter," she said when I finished. Not a question, more like she was tasting the fact. "He really did." Classic Gerald. She shook her head, smiling. All those years, and he couldn't just say things out loud like a normal person. "He got better," I said. "Near the end, he got better." "You're gonna be all right," Ruth said. It was not a question either, and it was not the reflexive thing people say in the first weeks of grief, the automatic "you'll be okay" they offer because silence is uncomfortable. It was an assessment. She was looking at me the way she has looked at me since we were 27 years old, clear-eyed and honest, and she was telling me what she saw. "I know," I said, and for the first time since March, I meant it without qualification. After Ruth went to bed, I sat outside alone for a while. The garden was in full June. Now the peonies Gerald had planted 3 years ago were blooming for the second time, big and heavy and pink. The maple was fully leaved, wide and certain in the dark. The neighborhood was quiet except for a dog somewhere, and the sound of someone's screen door, and the small, ordinary music of an ordinary evening in a city that keeps moving whether you're ready or not. I thought about what it means to be 64 years old in a house full of someone else's absence. I thought about how grief is not a problem to be solved or a phase to be managed. It's a landscape you learn to live in, different than before, with different light and different distances, but still yours, still inhabitable, still full of the things you planted and the things that grew. I thought about Gerald writing that letter, sitting at his desk at Hartwell and Associates, in the lunch hour maybe, or early before the building filled up, writing my name at the top of a page and then finding the words he couldn't find out loud. "I love you. I have loved you every single day." Simple as that. 38 years, and it came down to 9 words, and the 9 words were enough. That summer, I started writing things down. Not a journal. Exactly, I'd never been a journal person, always found it slightly self-conscious, like performing for a future reader who might not show up. More like notes, observations. Things I wanted to remember, and things I wanted to say out loud to nobody in particular. One afternoon in July, I wrote this. We talk about protecting the people we love as though protection is always something we do for someone else. But sometimes the most honest form of protection is trusting that the person you love can handle the truth. Gerald protected me in the way he knew how. I would have chosen differently. Both things can be true. I also wrote, Derek called on Sunday. We talked for 40 minutes. He told me about a problem at work he'd been struggling with and asked what I thought. I told him what I thought. He listened. This is new, or maybe it's old, the way we used to talk when he was younger, and didn't yet believe he had all the answers. I think grief does that sometimes. It takes a layer off. The layer we grow to seem competent and in control, and underneath it we're just people who love each other and don't always know how. And one more. Near the end of July, after a phone call with my doctor that went better than expected, after a long walk along the lakeshore in the early morning when the water was flat and silver and the city was still quiet, I am 64 years old. I have a house I love, a son who is learning, a friend coming back in October, a garden that is doing well without me fussing at it. I have a letter in the top drawer of the dresser, folded in thirds, in handwriting I would know anywhere. I have 38 years of a life that was good, imperfect, complicated, sometimes hard, but genuinely, consistently good. I am not at the end of anything. I am at the beginning of something I don't have a name for yet. That is frightening, and it is also, if I'm honest, a little bit interesting. The maple outside the window was deep green and full. I made a cup of tea and let it go warm in my hands and sat with the morning for a while, without rushing toward anything. If there is something I want you to take from this, something beyond the particular details of one woman's particular year, it is this. Your grief belongs to you, not to the people who love you, not to the people who want to help, not to the well-meaning voices that arrive with brochures and suggestions and a quiet certainty that they know what's best. They may love you deeply and still be wrong about what you need. You are allowed to stay in your house. You are allowed to make your own financial decisions. You are allowed to move at your own pace through loss and to define for yourself what moving forward means. Being 63 or 67 or 71 does not mean you are half a step from the edge. It means you have lived long enough to know your own mind, and that knowledge is worth something. It is worth protecting. When someone you love dies, the people around you will sometimes try to fill the space they left with decisions and plans and practical arrangements, not out of malice, usually, but out of the particular discomfort of watching someone they love stand in an open space and not knowing how to close it. Let them try. Let them bring you casseroles and brochures and offers to help. And then, gently, clearly, from a place of knowledge about who you are and what you need, tell them what's actually true. You are not a problem to be solved. You are not a space to be filled. You are a person in the middle of something hard, finding your footing, and you are more capable of finding it than anyone, including yourself, may currently believe. Trust what you know. You have always known more than you think. And if someone who loved you thought to leave a letter behind, read it twice, fold it carefully, put it somewhere you can find it again. Some things are worth keeping close.